So today I'm going to talk about a subject that touches on education, on online and digital learning, artificial intelligence and machine learning, and brain science, how we can play to our brain strengths to remember things more easily. So let's get started. As some as you might know, my wife is German, and like most monoglot English speakers, her English has always been so good that I never made the effort to learn German. But like many people, when lockdown came along in 2020, I decided that I was going to get serious about learning the language. So I started watching every YouTube video, promising to share the secret of how to learn a language in 3 months, tried every app on the App Store I could find, each with a slightly different technique in learning that promised to be the golden bullet I was looking for. I read every article I could find about breaking a language down to its components and learning it methodically, and the learning techniques and ways to make things stick in your head with minimum effort. And when lockdown ended, I knew a lot more about learning techniques and brain hacks, but had maybe added only a dozen or so words to my vocabulary. So I went back to normal life and sort of filed it away again. Then last year I decided off my own back that I was going to get serious about it this time. I was going to actually properly learn German. And when I started studying, it turned out that I'd learned more than I thought I had in 2020. Not more language, my German was still terrible at that point, but all the research and the articles I'd read and videos I'd watched, a lot of that stuff had actually stuck. So when I set about learning the language again last year, or towards the end of last year, I approached things differently. And as a result, things just seemed easier. So on the schedule, it said that I'll be talking today about spaced repetition, and I will touch on that. But I think a more accurate title of what I want to talk about today is tricking my brain to remember stuff with science, specifically in relation to language learning. So in the true spirit of bite-sized bio, I just want to share some tips and techniques I've come across or devised along the way, in case they're useful to anyone else. But the story that I want to tell starts quite appropriately in Germany in the 1870s. This is Hermann Ebbinghaus, and he was a German psychologist, and he was interested in studying why we forget things and how best to study so that we remember. So he used himself as a guinea pig, and he devised a list of 2,300 nonsense 3-letter words like zuck or quacks. And he wrote them all out in separate cards, and he would revise through them day after day, stare at each for a fraction of a second, think about it for 15 seconds, and move on. And then later test himself and if he could remember the sequence they came in and what each word was. And he would meticulously keep notes of which ones he remembered and which ones he forgot, each time he revised over time. And what he found was that he'd see a very rapid loss of recall in the first hour, and that would slow down so that after 9 hours, he'd forgotten about 60% of what he'd studied. And after a full day, he'd forgotten about 2/3. And this is known as the forgetting curve. But as you can see, each time you revise, that curve gets slightly shallower, so that most crucially, the closer you wait to the point of forgetting before revising again, the longer you'll remember things with the least amount of revision required. Now, this is all entirely anecdotal because he was the only test subject, but more scientifically rigorous tests have been carried out since that essentially back up his findings. And this method of revising with specific intervals came to be known as spaced repetition. Now, the first practical implementation of these findings also came from Germany, from a German science journalist called Sebastian Leitner in the 1970s. The basic idea is that you need a shoebox, a heap of empty index cards, scissors, sellotape, and I guess a lot of arts and crafts projects. So you divide the shoebox into 5 or 7 sections, you write out a card for each piece of information, plot a repetition calendar for how frequently you revisit each section, which is fine and it probably works, but I think you're probably getting close to the sort of territory I was in 2020, where you're spending more time thinking about the method of learning than doing the actual learning. But the way it works in practice is essentially this. So you imagine you have 5 or 7 boxes or compartments, and you write out on separate index cards everything you want to study. So you revise box 1 every first day, box 2 every second day, box 3 every third day, etc. So day 1, you would look at everything in box 1, and if you remember it, it bumps up to box 2, and if you forget it, it stays in box 1. And then at any point along the way, if you forget something, regardless if it's in box 5, it bumps back down to box 1 again. So that's how, in a nutshell, how it works. And for the longest time, a handmade solution like this was your only real option if you wanted to practice spaced repetition, until this guy came along. He is Peter Wozniak, and he was a molecular biology student in Poland back in the early 80s. It was actually through him that I first came across the concept of spaced repetition in 2008 when Wired magazine wrote an article about him. But back then he was frustrated about how much he had to learn as a molecular biology student. So to optimize his revision, he started doing his own experiments based on the forgetting curve and on spaced repetition. And this is some of his handwritten notes from the time. So he devised his own algorithm, which he called supermemory, and he applied it by hand to a study schedule. Now, this was increasingly more complex than a shoebox and some cards with arbitrary calendar gaps. He started factoring in things like if you've marked it as remembered previously but subsequently forgot it again, that's treated differently to a brand new card you're encountering for the first time. And as the formula grew and became increasingly complex, it became, as you would expect, unmanageable. But fortunately, around this time, he got his first computer, a ZX Spectrum, and he set about developing the world's first space repetition application, which he called SuperMemo. His super memory algorithm had evolved to version 2 by then, which he called SM2. He kept honing the algorithm. Every few years, he'd release a new edition of the software. And as of 2019, he's up to the latest version, which is SM18. But back in 1998, he made that original SM2 algorithm open source so that anyone could use it. So other software started to crop up, which included it, most noticeably Anki, which quickly became the standard space repetition app, despite running on the much older algorithm, purely by virtue of being free to use, unlike SuperMemo, and highly customizable. If you've had to study for anything in the last 15 years or so, you've probably encountered Anki at some point. So that's a history lesson over. Let's take a look at how Anki actually looks. Here's a basic language learning slide in Anki that I might have created. So on one side, we've got German there, and then you click show answer, and it would reveal the other side. So when you create a card, it actually creates two versions. So you've got one from English into German and one from German into English, so you can practice translating in both directions. So when this card comes up, I would see the text there, think about what if I knew what the answer was, and then click show answer. And then it would show me the answer and give me four options. I could either mark it as easy if I knew the answer straight away. If I had to think about it for a second, I could mark it as good. If I really had to think about it too long to actually use it in conversation, I would say it was hard. And if I didn't know the answer, I would click again. And as you can see, there are actual time intervals for when the card's going to come up again based on which button I click there. And this works. It's just plain text on the screen though, which is kind of boring, and we struggle to remember things if they're boring to us. So when you think of the English word bus stop, you're going to get mental images of bus stops you've stood in, bus stops in your street, lots of tiny associations firing off in your head. But if you're encountering the word Bushaltestelle for the first time, you've got none of that. And we want to be able to form the same level of mental associations in our head with this word as we do with the English word. That way, we're going to recall it much more easily. We need to trigger emotions when we think about this new word. We need to engage more of our senses. Is there anything we can do to make to bring this text to life and remember it more easily? How can we make it better? And this is where things start to get interesting. Anki forms the central nervous system of my entire German language studies. So every day I'm studying using a Pimsleur German audio course. I'm reading online articles in German. I'm listening to German talk radio in the background during the day in the house. I'm watching German TV shows. And on that front, I do strongly recommend Babylon Berlin, which you can find on Sky, and Der Tatort Reiniger. They're both brilliant. But I'm coming across vocabulary from a lot of different places. And each new word or phrase gets funneled into my Anki deck. So I only have that one single place that revives every day. Now that Pimsleur audio course that I mentioned, it's brilliant for getting you talking fast, but the built-in flashcard system is pretty terrible. It's a really valuable corpus of phrases, but there's no space repetition at all, which is why I started copying and pasting the card from Pimsleur into Anki. One thing Pimsleur does have in its favour, though, is that every card has audio recordings for each phrase. And when I copy paste into Anki, that's lost. Now, more than most other fields of study, when it comes to language learning, audio is crucial. That's because every language has its own pronunciation rule, and you don't know what you don't know. When I first went to Germany with Sydney 20 years ago, and I encountered this word, I would have pronounced it Lowenbrau. I had to actually hear it spoken aloud by a native German speaker to know that it's actually pronounced Löwenbräu. So having audio on my flashcards is crucial. Now, I could ask Sydney to record audio clips for each card, but I'm studying about 400 new cards every week, and her willingness to help me learn German probably doesn't quite stretch that far. So that leaves computer-generated text-to-speech, or TTS systems. The problem with a lot of traditional TTS systems is they sounded like this.
Hi there, I'm not a robot. Hi there, I'm not a robot.
Things have evolved over the last decade, though, to the point that we're now spoiled for choice. There's a lot of TTS systems out there, and I've tried them all, but for German voices, the most authentic I've found, are through Microsoft Azure. But unfortunately, you can't just go onto a website and use them. There's a few hoops to jump through. So you need to register as a developer with Microsoft. You need to set up a developer account, create a cloud application that integrates with Azure text-to-speech API, and link and authorize it to your Anki account. Now, this sounds complex, but it honestly only took 10 minutes to set up, and you only need to do it once. Once you've done that, though, every new card add to Anki automatically now gets an accompanying audio clip that sounds like this.
Eine süße Nachspeise serviert man mit einer süßen Beerenauslese, wobei das Dessert süßer sein sollte als der Wein.
Which is much more
Hi,
natural
there I'm
sounding.
not
Now,
a robot.
in a long clip like that, it still sounds slightly robotic. But for the short audio clips I'm putting in cards, or maybe just a couple of words to a sentence, it's hardly noticeable. And most crucially, the pronunciation is almost always spot on. So now we're starting to get places. Let's go ahead and add that audio clip to our card. There we go. So this is better than basic text. So as soon as the German side comes up on the card, it's going to automatically play the audio, and then I can just press that button again to keep adding more audio to it. So we're getting better, but let's keep engaging more senses. Our brains evolved to recall visual and spatial data more easily than almost anything else. Let's tap into that. So visual and spatial, what do I mean with that in relation to learning? Let's look at visual first of all. We still have the brains basically of hunter-gatherers. They haven't really caught up with modern society. Back in time, we needed to remember by sight that mushrooms which look like this are fine to eat. But Cousin Frank ate mushrooms that looked like this once, and well, Cousin Frank isn't with us anymore. And as for the little ones that look like this, Auntie Barbara liked to make a tea with those every few months, but then she doesn't sleep for 3 nights and starts talking to the ancestral elves. We attach emotional associations to visual memories, which helps us recall them later. And the more vivid it is, the more memorable. Now, that just doesn't happen with text on a page. Sure, a passage in a novel might move us emotionally, but it's not the words themselves that are doing that. It's the mental images we have created around the words that are responsible. If I showed you a list of 50 words that you'd never encountered before and 50 pictures you'd never seen before, and then asked you in an hour to pick the ones that I'd shown you, you would have a far better rate of success with the images than with the words. And we can trick our brains to remember things by tapping into this. And this is where it really starts to get fun. So say, for example, I wanted to remember the German word for sale, Angebot. And technically it means offer, but it's used how we would use sale. And a lot of German words and their English counterparts have the same origin. So they sound similar, or they're almost identical. That's the Saxon part of the Anglo-Saxon. But this has no relation to the English word sale. It's got a different etymology. So there's no direct way of connecting that word with the concept in my brain. And this card was just coming up a few days in a row, and it just wouldn't go in. Tried breaking the word down further. So Angebot, sale. Still nothing to hook onto in there. There's nothing to make it stick in my memory. How about Angela Merkel in a boat with loads of stuff she bought at the sales? Now, that might be a ridiculous image, but since I came up with it, I've never forgotten that word again, and now neither will you, and I'll be testing you later. But using images like this, or rhymes to remember how many days in the month, like 30 days has September, April, June, and November, any kind of device like this to aid memory is known as a mnemonic. Of course, you can't just jump onto Google Images and find a photo of Angela Merkel in a boat with some shopping bags. It probably doesn't exist. And when you're learning hundreds of new flashcards a week, there isn't really time to Photoshop each one by hand. Enter our new robot overlords. DALL-E 2, opening to the public last year, has revolutionized my flashcard creation. Incidentally, the previous image was a Photoshop rather than a DALL-E because they apparently have rules about generating images of politicians. Who knew? But let's see how I put this into practice. So the German word for traffic light is Ampel, which is a simple enough word, but at the back of my brain, I remember from driving the Netherlands that the Dutch word for speed bump is drempel. And every time I go rummaging in my brain looking for a German Ampel, I come back out carrying a Dutch drempel. Let's look at the word though. It sounds a bit like if you took the word amp and the word apple and kind of smushed them together. So just ask DALL-E to give me an image of a traffic light shaped like an apple with a guitar plugged into it. Not exactly what I imagined, but it does the trick. Sogar means even. I'm not remembering that. But Sammy Hagar, formerly of Van Halen, balancing evenly on a unicycle. I'm not forgetting that. Die Bushaltestelle, the word that we've already seen on the Anki card. So I always remember the bus halt part, and I kind of knew there was something came after it, but I can never quite remember what that last little bit was. Hey, DALL-E, show me a picture of bus made out of a can of Stella. So you get the idea. None of these images mean anything to anyone but me. But for me, the act of taking the time to analyze the word, find the pun or the joke in it, and create the image and add that to my deck, the process is refined, so it takes next to no time, but it helps build out the number of associations my brain makes with that word, making it easier to recall. So let's add this technique to the Anki card. As we do, though, they say that you should study a language as much as possible in that language. So you don't think in English and translate, you actually think in that language. There should be as little English as possible in your study materials. Now we've got the pictures, we can eliminate the English text completely and start thinking from mental concept directly into German. So now we have a card with audio and pictures. Much better. But this all falls apart when we come across one of my biggest stumbling blocks in the early stages of learning German: grammatical gender. In English, we have the single article the to refer to everything: the football, the library, the mobile phone. With German, we have 3 articles to remember depending on whether the word is designated as masculine, feminine, or neutral. So it's der Fußball, die Bibliothek, das Handy. Which article you use can actually affect your sentence structure. So if you get it wrong, the whole sentence can fall apart. And none of this makes any sense. There's no logic or pattern regarding which gender is for which word. You just have to learn it fresh for every single word that you learn. You might think that similar words would use the same gender, but no. In German, a spoon is masculine, a fork is feminine, and a knife is neutral. An apple mac is masculine, apparently, but the word for little girl, an actual living, breathing female, isn't feminine, it's neutral. If you're referring to this little girl doing her homework on that Mac, you wouldn't say she is doing her homework on it. You would say it is doing its homework on him. You can probably sense my frustration, and it's an area that I've always struggled. Now, I mentioned spatial memory before, so next we're going to look at a technique I've devised which I call word towns that I use for remembering the correct gender for nouns. But before I explain that, though, I probably need to explain more by what I mean about by spatial memory. Going back to our hunter-gatherer ancestors, they needed to remember that if you leave camp and go straight up along a river for a while until you reach the little waterfall, then you turn away from the river and keep going until you reach the big tree with a trunk that looks a bit like an old man's face, then turn left and keep walking until we come to that stack of boulders. Just behind that, there's a patch of really good brambles. We're inherently great navigators, and historically we had to be. Remembering how things relate to each other in 3D space comes naturally to us. It's how we take abstract thoughts, like the tree with a face, the boulders, the waterfall, and string them together into a narrative that makes sense to us, where to find the good brambles. It's because in our mind's eye, when we're thinking about that, we're actually walking through a 3D picture we've built up of the landscape and using each of these waypoints to navigate our way through it. And from this comes a learning technique that goes way back to ancient Greece. A technique called memory palaces or mind palaces or the method of loci. It's normally seen in films and TV shows to show that our protagonist is some sort of preternatural genius tapping into almost mystical powers of recall. The reality is nearly not as glamorous, but it's a genuine, practical mnemonic technique for recalling information relatively easily. There's actually memory championships every year where people from all over the world will challenge themselves to remember insane things using variations of this technique, like pi to 100,000 places, or an entire 57,000 word English-Chinese dictionary, to the point you could give them a random page number and word number on that page, and they could tell you exactly what it was. Now, most of the people that compete here are the first to tell you that they're not some sort of genius, they're just rigorous about applying a specific technique. It really is just a trick, but it's one that works, and it's one that absolutely anyone can learn. As a method of learning, though, it originates back to at least 477 BC with a poet called Simonides of Chios. He was at a meal, some grand function he'd been invited to recite his poetry, but he was called outside in business, so he had to leave the room temporarily, and while he was gone, the ceiling collapsed, killing everyone inside. Carnage. Some bodies were unrecognizable, so he was able to identify, though, every single body based on his recollection of where everyone sat in relation to him around the table, so that all the bodies could be returned to their respective families. And he realised how powerful a method of recall this had been, that he was able to just recall in a flash exactly where everything was. And he started thinking about how it could be used to recall other information. And the method he came up with quickly became the standard amongst the famous philosophers of the day. We know that Plato and Aristotle, amongst others, used this technique. The commonly held opinion was that you only actually knew something if you could recall it from memory. Back then, the written word was cheating. Somewhere between then and here, this method seems to have fallen out of favour slightly, maybe because it requires some effort to set up before you actually start learning anything. And if you read something in a book and then you know exactly where to find it again later, that's just easier. But you can't look up every second word in the middle of a conversation. You need to be able to recall it from memory. So let's look at how we can use this technique to help. Specifically, let's look to how I use it to remember the grammatical genders. So this is Almere. It's about 25 minutes by car from Amsterdam. My wife and I actually wanted to move here about a decade ago, mainly because the houses all look like this. It's quite incredible. You can walk up a street and every house looks different to every other house. But this actually makes it perfect for my idea of a word town, because it has a number of clearly defined districts, and each district looks quite distinctly different to every other. You can tell at a glance what neighbourhood you're in. And the whole town's been extensively mapped on Google Maps and Street View and has 3D models for almost all of the buildings. So you can fly around and really build up a sense of space. It even has Street View images of pedestrianised areas and footpaths that no Street View car could get up. So you can walk up and down almost every street in the city from the comfort of your own couch. The benefit to this is that I don't need to visit the town to recall its geography, so I can easily build and strengthen that 3D map in my brain of how everything relates to everything else. So what I've done is I've selected 3 different neighbourhoods in the town, and I've designated one for masculine nouns, one for feminine nouns, and one for neutral. And then I plot a route through each neighbourhood, and I call these routes journeys. So this is part of my feminine word journey. So I plot a route through the neighbourhood, I'll walk up and down every street methodically on street view, making a list of landmarks along the way. So I'll maybe decide that that lamppost there is a landmark, and that couple walking up the street is the next landmark after that. And then that silver car there might be the third one. And I'll plot these all onto a spreadsheet along with the embed code to jump straight into that view in Street View. Then for each waypoint, I'll associate a noun that I'd like to learn. Then all I need to do is just imagine the mnemonic image I came up with for that word in that location. So let's say that here in this location, in front of that house there, is the location I want to remember our word for bus stop. So every time I try and recall the word for bus stop, I see that image of the bus that looks like a can of Stella. So I remember that it's Bushard Stella. But in my mind's eye, I also see that image in this location. So I know that this location is part of my feminine noun journey. So I know it's got to be Die Bushard Stella. And once I've revised it a few times, this entire thought process has only taken a fraction of a second. Having both the image and the location associated with the word are triggering 2 different parts of my brain, which helps to form deeper levels of association. And that's it. So every week I'll go for a wander up another street in these neighbourhoods, plot the next street's worth of landmarks of each journey, and add them to my spreadsheet. And when I come across a new noun I want to remember, I can just plot it next to the location in the spreadsheet and immediately imagine them in this location. Let's take a final look at our cards now. We have a card that's gone way beyond plain text on a screen now. It has text, it has audio, it has an image, and now it has a physical location as well. So we've got rich data that engages our reading comprehension, our listening comprehension, our visual memory, and our spatial memory. And because it has no English on it, I'm not translating in my head, but I'm thinking directly in German. Furthermore, because the street view is an embed rather than just a photo, I can look around directly inside Anki and even sort of navigate up and down the street to help build up that image association in 3D space at the point of revision. So that's how my Anki cards look now. So every weekend I'll spend a few hours creating new cards, adding any images, placing them in a location, then importing them into Anki from a spreadsheet so that I've got enough to keep me busy studying through the coming week. If I come across any new words or phrases day to day while I'm watching TV or reading an article, I can just add them to the spreadsheet and they'll get processed at the weekend. I'm an early riser generally, so every morning before the rest of the world's awake, I'll spend an hour just studying through my Anki cards before the day begins. There is still a few neighbourhoods left over here for other things that I plan to do, something with declensions and verb conjugations, but they're a bit more complicated to figure out mnemonics for, so I'm not figured that one out yet. The thing with mind maps, though, is that you get to the point that you don't really need to even bring up Anki or your spreadsheet or Street View. It's the whole point of mind maps. You can conjure up the location and the mnemonic in your head and just go for a wander. It's great for internalising the thought process of recalling the word. You can run through it while you're driving, while you're doing the dishes. I like to go for a wander around them when I'm drifting off to sleep at night. I think it's a technique that almost everyone can benefit from. I actually have a vision of an app that combines the method of loci with structured lessons and spaced repetition to allow people to harness the technique for learning anything, sort of like a headspace crossed with Anki. Maybe once I've learned German, I'll get around to building it. But that's all I have to say. Thanks for listening. In case you're interested in learning more on this stuff, I'd recommend these 3 books, and there's links there as well to some of the applications and articles that I mentioned. So yeah.